Hi, I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the multivocal, democratic spirit of our literary tradition a vital part of the culture. I hope you'll consider supporting our work and this free LOA Live series by becoming a member. You can learn more at loa.org/join. A special welcome to LOA members who are joining us tonight, and a warm thanks to our promotional partners for this program: the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers, the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute at NYU, and the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin. Jimmy Breslin, brash, opinionated, funny, an inimitable chronicler of colorful characters, and a tireless champion of the vulnerable over the rich and powerful, brought heart, spirit, and knockout prose to everything he wrote. In his now legendary column about President Kennedy's funeral, he movingly evoked the nation's grief and reverence through an interview with Clifton Pollard, the $3.01 an hour working man who dug the grave at Arlington. It's quintessential Breslin, whose special gift was an instinct for the untold, personal dimension of every story. Winner of the Pulitzer Prize for commentary, and incredibly fun to read, Jimmy Breslin raised deadline journalism to literary art. A new Library of America volume brings together his very best writing. 73 columns and articles, more than half collected for the first time, and 2 books: How the Good Guys Finally Won, a tribute to the old school Democratic politicians who brought down Richard Nixon, and The Short, Sweet Dream of Eduardo Gutierrez, the story of an undocumented immigrant laborer killed in a construction site accident in Brooklyn. Jimmy Breslin, Essential Writings, volume number 377 in the Library of America series, is edited by Dan Barry, who joins us tonight. And a link to more information about the book will be dropped in the chat. Dan Barry is a reporter and columnist for the New York Times. He's won a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting, the Best American Newspaper Narrative Award, the Meyer Mike Berger Award from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, and the American Society of Newspaper Editors Award for deadline reporting. His books include This Land, America Lost and Found, a collection of columns first published in the Times. He joins us from his home in Maplewood, New Jersey. Joining Dan to explore and reminisce about Jimmy Breslin's life and work are 2 very distinguished colleagues. Award-winning print and broadcast journalist and commentator Mike Barnicle is a regular contributor to MSNBC's Morning Joe. He's written more than 4,000 newspaper columns and continues to write for the Daily Beast, Time, the Huffington Post, Politico, and Esquire. He joins us from Lincoln, Massachusetts. Longtime Daily News columnist Mike Lupica, he filed his first column for the paper in 1977, is a member of the Sports Media Hall of Fame and winner of the Damon Runyon Award. Author of 16 New York Times bestsellers, his most recent book is 12 Months to Live, his 4th crime thriller, co-authored with James Patterson. He joins us from his home in Wellington, Florida. We invite your questions and comments. The Q&A button is on your menu bar. Please let us know where you're viewing from. And now, please welcome our moderator, Library of America staff editor on the Breslin edition, Jim Gibbons.
Thank you, Max. Thank you, Dan, Mike, and thank you everyone for who's in attendance. I'm very excited about this volume. It was sort of a labor of love, and I want to just thank Dan for being such a gracious editor and someone who was very patient with us at LOA and putting together. It was a pretty long gestation, finding all these columns and evaluating them and putting them together. But I think what we've assembled here is really remarkable, and it just is a tribute to what a great writer Breslin was. And I just, as sort of an epigraph to the evening, before I hand it over, I'd like to, the program is called Deadline Artist, and that's a word maybe that gets thrown around a bit about people who are writing columns, but I was looking through the volume today, and Breslin wrote an extraordinary column about the shooting of, the fatal shooting of John Lennon. And a few years later, when he collected that particular column in a book, he included a brief headnote. I think just in a very terse and kind of laconic way, it gets at the heart of the thing that Breslin could do so well in such a short span of time. And he writes, this is December 8th, 1980, and he writes, I was home in bed in Forest Hills, Queens at 11:20 p.m. when the phone and television at once said Lennon was shot. I was dressed and into Manhattan, to Roosevelt Hospital, the Dakota, up to the precinct, grabbed the cop inside, back to the Dakota, grabbed the cop outside, and to the Daily News. I wrote this column and it made a 1:30 a.m. deadline. I don't think there's anybody else who can do this kind of work this quickly. And I think Breslin's probably right about that. This idea that within 70 minutes, he goes from being at home in Queens in bed to filing this story that certainly today is just remarkable and is certainly worth revisiting. And I recommend it to you all. It's a tribute to how he really was this kind of incredible deadline artist. I guess we could start with some words of Breslin, and for that, Mike Lupica has said that he'd like to read something from Breslin's account of being in the emergency room when President Kennedy was shot in 1963. So, Mike, I'm going to hand that over to you.
Thanks, Jim. It has a Dallas Dateline. The call bothered Malcolm Perry. Dr. Tom Shires, stat, the girl's voice said over the page in the doctor's cafeteria at Parkland Memorial Hospital. The stat meant emergency. Nobody ever called Tom Shires, the hospital's chief resident in surgery, for an emergency, and Shires, Perry's superior, was out of town for the day. Malcolm Perry looked at the salmon croquettes on the plate in front of him. Then he put down his fork and went over to the telephone. This is Dr. Perry taking Dr. Shires' page, he said. President Kennedy has been shot. Stat, the operator said. They are bringing him into the emergency room right now. I said to everybody before we started tonight, everybody knows the Clifton Pollard Gravedigger column, but this death in emergency room one is one of the greatest things that's ever appeared in an American newspaper.
Well, just actually, Mike, just in case a few people in our audience don't know about Clifton Pollard, can you tell us about him very briefly?
Well, no, Max had mentioned him. It's the Gravedigger.
Yes.
The Gravedigger column is now taught in journalism schools. It's probably the most famous thing that Jimmy ever wrote. But as Mike and Dan and I were talking before we started tonight, this was the piece before that, and Dan's going to read a piece that came after that, and it just shows the range of not just Jimmy's talent as a writer, but his talent as a reporter and really a novelist.
Yeah. I mean, just to set the stage, I mean, many people will know this, but Breslin had been recently hired at the New York Herald Tribune, and that's the paper he was writing for in November 1963. And he went down to Dallas, and he was in the emergency room. And then 2 days after the story that you just read from about being in the emergency room, there appeared a story about Clifton Pollard, the man who dug the grave for President Kennedy at Arlington Cemetery. And that has led to this idea of the gravedigger theory of journalism. The idea is that you want to look in a story for an unlikely person that somehow expresses something about the story that everyone else is missing. You know, it's a little bit of a corollary to the sort of dictum of sports writers to say, if you want the real story, don't go to the winner's locker room, go to the loser's locker room. Though I would say it's probably even better in this particular case, because it's not just a division between losers and winners. It's finding this angle of the story that no one would have thought to write. In the Kennedy funeral, of course, there were so many. The world press had descended upon Washington and Arlington, and Breslin was the only one who was talking to the gravedigger. And
Jim, Jim,
anyway, I will.
Jimmy always this whole theory that you're talking about. Jimmy gave a lot of credit to Murray Kempton, because the day Don Larson pitched his perfect game in the World Series, Kempton went and wrote about Sal Magley, who had pitched the game of his life and lost 2-0 that day.
Yeah. So, Dan, you were going to follow that up with a story that appeared 5 days later, and until it's been collected in our volume, I can safely say that basically no one would know it, because it only was being read by its original readers, and it's been kind of buried in the archives for many decades. So can you set that up, Dan?
Sure. So as we've talked, Breslin went down to Dallas. He writes about the emergency room. He does that extraordinary piece on Deadline about the gravedigger. And then he returns to New York at some point. And what's remarkable to me is how in this piece he addresses the unspoken. So the setup is he comes back from Dallas and it's Thanksgiving and he decides to work and he goes to an automat on 34th Street and 8th Avenue. And if anyone remembers the automat, you would put coins in a slot and out would come baked beans and hot dogs or what have you. And they also had very good coffee. And so he went there in a New York City representing an entire country that was probably paralyzed with grief. And he recognizes this. And so he goes on Thanksgiving to the automat on 34th and 8th, and he describes men, lonely men who live in SROs, gathering at the automat and basically talking about really nothing, but they're really talking about this massive national, international loss. And so I'll just read the ending. So he sets it up. He has the men talking. It's very quiet. The nickels are going into the automat. He says that the coffee is quite good. And then he says, outside, 8th Avenue is vacant. A few cabs moved by. Now and then, a bus. The few people on the street were old and alone. There were some post office workers. They were paid yesterday, and they scouted around 8th Avenue for someplace open so they could cash the check. Otherwise, it was a vacant day in the automat. Which was right? Yesterday was a day meant to be vacant. It seemed right to sit on Thanksgiving Day and put out butts in a coffee cup, and every once in a while, have an attendant in white shirt and slacks reach past your shoulder and take crumpled napkins from the table. So what he does is he evokes people crying, really, with the crumpled napkins, and they're crying for their lost leader. And he never once mentions the assassination. He never once mentions Kennedy, and he doesn't mention crying.
Yeah, that's really very, very powerful. And I think you don't think of Breslin as a writer of restraint. You think of him as someone who's very brash and pugnacious. But in this particular case, as you show, there's a kind of a novelistic subtlety here that he's bringing to this account. And it's a column in a paper. And it's as we've said, this is a piece of writing that is completely ephemeral for the time, and has not been read by anyone. 1963, and yet excavating it, we find this kind of power in it. And it's something that comes across in so many of Breslin's columns. I think that I think Breslin, if you listen to interviews with him, someone will ask him, well, what would be your advice for a journalist? And he'll say something like, just tell the stories, and it's very terse and it's very laconic, and yet, when you actually read what Breslin writes, he's not just telling the stories in the sense that it's like a basic thing. There's all sorts of other things that he's doing, things that he's bringing in. In this Lenin piece that I mentioned before, he follows 3 of the policemen who were on the scene, and he mentioned how he talked about how the one had seen Beatlemania last recently, and then how one remembers hearing Beatles songs, or that his sons did it, and it's incredibly evocative in a very short space. And I think that as I say, there's a sense that Breslin isn't just reporting news in this very straightforward way. He's doing a lot of very, very sophisticated things, and often in a very short span of time, given how much he can write. So thank you, Dan, for selecting that in the first place for the volume, and for reading some of it tonight. I want to bring in Mike Barnicle because we haven't heard from him yet. And is there something you'd like to read, Mike?
Yes, it's a piece written in March of 1979 from Jerusalem. And part of Breslin's genius, and it was literally genius, is that he could take his skill to Churchill's funeral. He could take his skills to Northern Ireland. And he could take his skills, obviously, to Jerusalem and capture a moment through the eyes, the voice, and the feelings of people on the ground, people who actually live there. And he could bring you, the reader, into that world, a world that he would create with his skill as a writer, as a reporter, and as a trained observer. This one is from a refugee camp. The Bethlehem refugee camp is an old one. An old man sat at a table in a hut in the camp where he sells notepads and candy bars. He said his name was Muhammad Abdullah, and when asked for his age, he wrote the number 37. The number 62 was jotted down and shown to him. He shook his head and printed out 42. When the figure 84 was printed in retaliation, Abdullah became angry and wrote down the number 58. Finally, after 15 minutes of bargaining, he admitted to being 71. When he was asked about the peace treaty, he shook his head. We are no peace treaty. We are Palestinians. We must wait and we will get our peace. That could have been written from Gaza today. That was Jimmy's magic.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting that you read that particular passage too, because people think of Breslin as a New York figure. He was kind of the quintessential New Yorker. But we also have in the volume a lot of other journalism that shows him filing dispatches from Vietnam, for example, or writing about civil rights in the South during the 60s. And as you say, he went to England and Ireland and then to the Middle East on these trips. And he's someone who really shows himself to be quite worldly. He's not just kind of a local guy, even though he's very much grounded in his identity, not just really as a New Yorker, but as a guy from Queens. And I think that the passage that you just read is an example of how you can put him anywhere. I mean, for the short sweet dream of Eduardo Gutierrez, he went to Mexico and he wrote this biography of a man that no one would ever write a biography of, it would seem. And he would seem to be totally forgotten. And he's doing this quite late. He's doing this in the 90s into 2000. So it's not, there's something about Breslin that was very consistent over a span of many, many decades. And I think when that book came out, I remember when it came out, people felt that sort of book that they might imagine a younger writer writing, which presumably for a writer is quite a compliment, I would say. When you would say it would look like someone younger would have written it.
Mike just referenced the columns that Jimmy wrote when Churchill was dying, which are just epic. And he's standing outside the house where Churchill was in an upstairs room dying. And Michael, you remember he's talking to people on the street, and one of them said, "He was there when we needed him." And again, it just and then the next person says, "We would have been lost without him." And he talked about Churchill dying in the understated way that his people live. And it was just so damn good.
Well, yeah. Part of his gift, Mike, and Dan Barry does this not often enough for readers, actually. Jimmy knew, stand at the edge of the circle, at the edge of the story. Don't barge into the center of the story, because there'll be other people there trying to write the story. You'll pick up more on the edge of a story and find someone who is down in their luck or happy or whatever. You'll find someone who will drive the story for you. Dan Barry does that better than anyone else alive today.
You're here. So Breslin was kind of a larger than life figure. I think we can safely say he's the only journalist who will ever host Saturday Night Live. Mike, you knew him, yes? You worked with him. Can you tell him? Can you tell us a couple stories about Breslin that reflect sort of who he was and made an impact on you?
Okay, I'm going to tell a couple of quick ones, because he and Pete Hamill, their office was about 100 feet down from the sports department at the Daily News. So it was just, I'm like 12 years old and I can go down and talk to these guys who all I'd ever wanted to be was them. But there was a point where, I know this will shock Mike and Dan, but I had gotten some death threats. And so anybody who called the paper wanting to talk to me had to give their phone number and their address. And Breslin was, he didn't want to walk, he had a question for me, and he didn't want to come down the hall. And so he called Dolores Thompson, who ran the sports department for 100 years, and he wanted to talk to me. And she knew who it was. And she said, "Who is this, please? You know who this is." Where? And so it de-escalates from there. And finally he slams down the phone and he never gets me. But to get revenge with her, a week later, he quoted her in a column and added 10 years to her age. And that was Jimmy's way of getting even with Dolores Thompson. And here's one other story that was extremely meaningful to me. I had just started writing a column at the Daily News, and Dick Young had grown increasingly, help me out here, Mike, cantankerous.
He was pissed off at you, Mike.
Yeah.
He was jealous of you.
So he's killing Dan, you remember, he's killing Tom Seaver day after day after day. So my first column, I defended Seaver. And Young was also the sports editor at the time. And so he calls me into his office and he said, "I'm not going to get into a pissing contest with a member of my own staff." And I said, "Well, Mr. Young, you have a column, I have a column. I was told to write what I thought and what I believed." And he said, "You're not doing that here." So I go down the hall to Breslin and I tell him what just happened. He grabs me by the arm. He walks me through the city room. He walks me down to Mike O'Neill's office. He was the editor of the Daily News at the time. He walks past O'Neill's assistant. And Mike could have been talking to Jesus at the time, and Breslin didn't care. He goes barging into his office and he said, "Tell him what you just told me." And I said, "Well, Mr. O'Neill, here's what just happened." And Mike said, "You write whatever you want to write. And if anybody screws you again, come to me." But it wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have empowered me if Jimmy's standing as Jimmy Breslin hadn't gotten me through that moment.
I would like Dan Barry to tell us how he met Jimmy Breslin, when he met Jimmy Breslin, and the impact that Jimmy Breslin had in your life, Dan. And then I will tell you about the first time I met Jimmy Breslin.
I'll try and make it quick. I was writing a column in the city, and obviously I'd grown up reading Breslin and worshiping him, and I was also going through cancer, and I don't know how he found out. I guess it's a sign of how good of a journalist he was. But he found out that I was going through cancer and that I was going to Sloan Kettering. And I got a call from this guy that I'd never spoken to before saying, "When are you going over there?" And I said, like, "What do you mean?" He said, "When are you going to that place? I'll go with you." And I was taken aback, and finally I realized he was talking about Sloan Kettering. And I said, "Well, I'm going there on Thursday for, a kind of serious scan." And he says, "I'll go with you." And so we arranged to meet at 72nd and Broadway. And I'd never met him. I knew what he looked like, and he didn't know what I looked like. So I see him walking up down Broadway. I introduced myself. He said, "Good, let's go." And so I'm anxious about this scan. It's going to turn out not to be great. And what he does is he just begins talking. He's never met me before, but we have a bond, I guess, in newspaper journalism. And he just starts telling me about boxing matches and Wise Guys and Gotti and, all sorts of crazy things. He's cursing up a storm. Every other word is the F-bomb. And suddenly I'm in front of Sloan Kettering, and all my nerves had just kind of gone away for a little while. And he says, "When's your wife getting here? She should be here." And I said, "Well, she'll be right here in a minute." And she comes around the corner. From then on, he never uses another F-bomb. We go into the hospital, and I'm saying, "Thank you, Mr. Breslin. Thanks so much. I'll go with you." He goes up to me up to the lab, basically. He's there when I get into my Johnny. I get into my Johnny. I go into this small room, and there's my wife, and there's Breslin. There's Jimmy Breslin, and the room is the size of like a closet. And it goes on, and he keeps making jokes with the nurses and really kind of like providing great distraction. And the joke is that I finally get on the gurney, and I'm on the gurney, and Breslin's still there. And the joke is that I made room for him. But he finally goes, and And, you know, it's not great. And the next day I'm walking around the city feeling sorry for myself. And he calls me, "What do you got for tomorrow?" Meaning my column. I said, "Jimmy, I was thinking of not writing. I think I needed a break." And he uses the bad word again. And he says, basically, "Screw that. Look around. Look at the pavement. Everywhere you go, a story. Write. Goodbye." That's what happened. And so I'm basically being called out by Jimmy Breslin to write. And I went back and wrote about a walk across Central Park, finding distraction in the movies of other people. And that's how I met him. And it's a sign, I think, you know, he had this Jimmy Breslin persona of being a tough guy and being rude. And certainly there were those elements to his personality. But at his heart, he was a big-hearted, very emotional guy. And he knew Sloan Kettering from loss in his own family of his wife and one of his daughters at Sloan Kettering. And Ronnie, his second wife, told me that he would write stories about something really tragic, and he would have to take to bed. He would take it so personally that he would go to bed and just need to decompress and process what he had witnessed.
Yeah, I believe it. I mean, I've told you that my first introduction to Jimmy Breslin was when I would get off the train at Kenmore Station in Boston, Massachusetts, the trolley, on the way to BU, where I attended college for a couple of years. And I would stop and pick up the New York Herald Tribune at the newsstand and read this guy. And Dick Schaap was in the Herald Tribune, and John Crosby and Art Bookwald, but Breslin, his stuff would jump off the page. So fast forward several years, and it's the fall of 1974, and Boston has begun to implement school busing, and the sidewalks are aflame with violence. And Tom Winship, the editor of the Globe, one of his specialties, he was a wonderful man, an incredible editor, and I loved him to death. But one of his specialties was to try and put scorpions in a bottle to see which one would survive. So lo and behold, in mid-September 1974, who shows up as a guest columnist for the Boston Globe in the newsroom? One Jimmy Breslin. And it was like, oh my God, this is going to be terrible for me, for everyone. And so he wrote a piece one day, and I was writing a piece on the same day that he was going to write. This was like for a Sunday paper. And I wrote what I wrote. He wrote what he wrote, and I was shaking. He sat in the newsroom with us. He was about 2 desks away from me. Both pieces appeared in the Sunday paper. Monday, I go back to work in the morning trying to figure out what I'm going to do for the day. Breslin is there already before me. And he comes up to me and he says, "Hey, kid, you're making me play an away game, huh? That's okay. Good for you. Good for you." And that was my introduction to him in person.
All right. I'm going to tell a Boston story about when I met him, and because it was when Rosemary was sick by then, and they were coming up to Boston a lot. And so I'm riding around in a Volkswagen Bug. I'm writing for the Boston Phoenix. I'm working nights at the Globe, and I'm sitting at the Phoenix one day, and somebody says, "There's a call for you." And I pick up the phone and I hear, "This is James Breslin of New York City." And I said, "Yeah, sure it is." And the long story is Jim Bellows had taken over the Washington Star, and he was looking for a young columnist that eventually became David Israel. And he said, "But I want to bring me some stuff." Okay. I said, "Where are you?" He said, "I'm at Charlie Daly's house." I say, "Okay." I jump into my car. I get back to my little apartment in Brighton, and I realize I have no idea who Charlie Daly is. None, zero. I call the Cambridge police, and I said, "Do you know who Charlie Daly is?" Well, of course, it's Michael Daly's dad, who was was he a vice president of
Harvard.
He was Mike, right? He was a vice president of Harvard.
Yes, yeah.
The only information was he said, "I'm in Cambridge and there's a white picket fence out front." And I go over there and I meet him, and it's like my whole life is passing in front of my eyes. And it's a job that I will not get. And I can't believe that sitting across the kitchen table from me is Jimmy Breslin. And that began, a relationship with him and a friendship with him that lasted until the day he died. And I mean, when you talk about Sloan Kettering, Dan. I mean, this man buried a wife and two daughters, Kelly and Rosemary, in his life. So he knew a lot about being wounded. It's why he wrote so well about wounded people. And Dan, it's probably why you nearly snuggled with him on the gurney that day.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about Breslin as a public figure? Because as I said, he for example, he ran for city council president in 1969.
Yes, he did.
And what was he thinking? Or what do you think he was thinking when he did that?
Well, his running mate was Norman Mailer, so it tells you that it was kind of there was a Quixote-like theme to this thing, and Joe Flaherty was their campaign. I mean, it was this thing, but I mean, it was, they had an awful lot of fun along the way. Wow. Ronnie Eldridge, his second wife, is the one who should have been the mayor of New York City.
I think what was happening was Breslin was a little bored. He had a book coming out, The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. And I think he wanted to make some points about how the city council and the city government were working. And so he hitched his wagon with Norman Mailer, and he fairly quickly realized that Mailer was nuts. He said he didn't realize, and their campaign was, a World Series of stickball and the secession of New York City from New York State and things like that. But there were more serious parts of their platform. But Mailer would get drunk and call the audience a bunch of spoiled pigs down in the village.
Yeah.
And Breslin didn't think that was really a winning strategy. And he said, I didn't realize that I was running with Ezra Pound. So, but Breslin took great pride because when, surprisingly, they lost. I don't know what happened, but they lost that campaign.
Who can figure? Yeah.
But Breslin took great pride in having won way more votes than Mailer did. So.
Yeah, but you could also remember that Breslin also, as I said, he hosted Saturday Night Live. He was there was a sitcom that was kind of abortive that was based on his family life.
He had a late night show. He had a late night show.
Yeah. So was it for the money, or was it for something else that he decided that he always wanted to be in the public eye in a way that a lot of other journalists might not be?
Well, he never thought journalism should be the Lawn Tennis Association. He would always say, "You're not just playing for the love of the game." But Pete used to say that he wasn't sure that Jimmy knew. Dan and Mike may be able to speak to this, but Pete was like could have taught a master class in Breslin. And he always would say he wasn't sure if Jimmy knew how much entertainment, apart from his column, he had provided for the rest of us. And I'm not sure he did, because he was a larger than life character. Pete made the mistake one time. Dan, I don't know, Mike, I don't know if you know the story, but Pete had discovered that Nelson Algren, who wrote The Man with the Golden Cup, was living in a little one-floor walk-up over in Hoboken. And Pete's going to write a piece about him for the Daily News Sunday magazine, which we still had in those days. But he makes a rookie mistake, and he tells Jimmy that he's found Nelson Algren over in Hoboken. The next day, Pete picks up the paper, and there's Jimmy's column about this genius living in a one-floor walk-up over in Hoboken. So this is it. This is the time that Pete's finally going to kill him. And he's picking up the phone to call him. And as a preemptive strike, Jimmy calls him. And this is what Pete hears. I needed it. And Jimmy hangs up. And that was his entire explanation for, I needed it.
The backstory there is really a nice one. I mean, Pete Hamill, in his own way, watched over Jimmy.
Yes, he did.
Because he knew that Jimmy was prone to maybe annoying or alienating people that he ought not to, and not because they were being important to him, but because they were like decent people. And Peter, sort of really watched over him. Like, for instance, I was telling Pete one day about Jimmy in Boston. This is in the early 80s. and he wanted to have breakfast with me. And he was staying at the old Ritz-Carlton Hotel on Arlington Street, right across from the public gardens. And we were going to have breakfast at about 8 o'clock. And I get to the Ritz-Carlton Cafe for breakfast at about 5 minutes of 8. And an old Italian fellow was the maitre d', Joe Mastrangelo. And I walk in and he says, "Mike, how you doing today?" I says, "Pretty good, Joe." I said, "I'm supposed to meet Jimmy Breslin here." He says, "I just threw him out." I said, "I'm sorry, what?" He says, "I just threw him out." He says, what happened? What happened? He says, "He come in here." He says, he's got his shirt open, untucked, untied, unbuttoned. He says he's got food all over the shirt, that he's, it's clearly an old shirt. And he goes and sits down on a corner table, and I walk over. I said, "Excuse me, sir, Mr. Breslin." I said, can we clean you up a little? Because we have guests coming in here and everything like that. Maybe get a jacket on you. He says, and Mr. Breslin stands up and shouts, and he says, "It's full, as you can see, almost full." He says, "F you, I don't need this." And he walks out. So we didn't have breakfast that day. We had takeout someplace else. But I mean, that's the kind of things I think that Peter used to watch out for Jimmy on. Just don't do that, Jim.
Pete was the good cop, Mike. Pete was the good cop.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to a couple of questions we have from our chat here, and speak, since you brought up Hamill. This is a question from Neil McGarrigle in the UK, and he's wondering about both Breslin and Hamill, their relationship and the role of Irish identity in their work and friendship. And Neil says, "Many thanks from County Tyrone in the Old Country."
Yeah.
So does anyone have a view about Ireland or Jimmy's
It's amazing
Irish
I ever
American?
got a column in New York City, by the way, with my last name. I just want to say that I really, as an Italian, I was an oppressed people, and because Irish columnists did pretty well in New York City and in Boston and at the New York Times. It's a good fraternity.
Dan, I don't know about you, but I always felt in reading Peter, when he would write about the Irish in Ireland, that it was steeped in history and the fact that the Irish bore so much in terms of brutality under the wing of the British government for years and years. And Jimmy, when he would write about the Irish from Ireland or in Ireland, it would be basically what he does writing about anyone in New York or Chicago, anybody in America. He would write about the person that he was writing about. But there was a larger theme, I think, and Dan, you'd tell me if you would agree or if you have another viewpoint on it. I think even though they were writing specifically about the Irish, and they were Irish, and I'm Irish, you're Irish, Lupica is not Irish, it was not restricted so much to where they were from as to who they were and who they became and who they were that day that he stood in front of them talking to them in order to write about them, no matter what country it took place in.
Yeah, I agree. They both came from, working class and, somewhat challenging circumstances, the way they grew up. I think that they both shared a facility with language and a gift for imagery that, is maybe unfairly ascribed to Irish writers. Breslin, though, I think Breslin, as opposed to Pete pretty much gave up on the Catholic Church a long time ago and Irish Catholicism. Breslin, which I think would surprise a lot of people, was very, very devoted to his faith. And he felt betrayed by what he called the shopping mall faces or shopping center faces, the Irish shopping center faces. And what he's talking about is Irish Americans who had forgotten where they had come from and were now, in his view, voting Republican and voting against the working class from which they came. And his Catholicism really informed a lot of his view of the world. And that's why when he writes The Church That Forgot Christ, it's a cry of the heart, because he feels betrayed by the priest scandals, and he feels betrayed by the bishops who are living in mansions because they're not living the Catholic faith that he knew. So I think that his faith and his Irishness absolutely informed his writing, but I wouldn't say he wore it on his sleeve. It's in the language, I think.
He got really angry about the Catholic Church the older he got. I mean, he got increasingly vocal and increasingly angry about what,
and rightly so.
Yeah. Oh,
yes.
100%. And he stopped holding back. Not that Jimmy ever held back very much, but the church really started to piss Jimmy off.
Yeah. Well, he had a specific target too in the early part of the century. A guy from Boston, Billy Murphy, who was in I think he wasn't the Archbishop of Boston. That was Bernard Law, but he was Law's deputy. So he was like the deputy bishop or the adjutant bishop of Boston. And he ended up on Long Island in Rockville Center, I believe.
Right.
And Breslin absolutely tortured him. It was brilliant the way he tortured him too, because you knew, well, Dan, you would know better than I do because you were down there and everything like that every day. But living in a castle that he rebuilt on the heels and the wallets of the parishioners, and it was just wonderful, wonderful stuff. Vintage Breslin.
Right, and mostly, and also coupled with that, the mishandling and the deceit regarding, the priest scandals that had peppered the diocese, just like many other dioceses around the country.
Yeah.
We've gone this far into this, and again, I have to say this again. I've said it before we were on the air. Dan, you just did a brilliant job assembling.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, putting
impossible
this
job.
like this man. But we have.
I had to rewrite the Gravedigger story. I had to edit it a little bit.
Well, no, Dan, it needed some punching up. Good for you.
Yeah, it did, The ending.
We've gone this far into this conversation without talking about what I thought were the two proudest things he did. One was he stood up in the face of everything that was happening in the city and went after Bernard Getz. Okay, and it was a classic example of how Jimmy did not ever run with the crowd. And
explain who Bernie Getz was.
Bernie Getz shot unarmed. He was accosted by some unarmed kids in a subway, and he shot them. And
subway vigilante. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a hideous story, but everybody tried to make a folk. Remember, Mike and Dan, he tried to make a folk hero out of this guy for pulling a gun and shooting these unarmed kids. Okay, that's one, and it was, to me, it showed, in addition to everything else, how brave Jimmy was. Mm-hmm. And the other one is he put faces and names to AIDS patients, and it won him the Pulitzer Prize. And a time when people, even in our business, were afraid to even be in the same room with AIDS patients. And Jimmy, it's one of the shining moments of his career. And thank God they finally, I mean, he could have won the Pulitzer Prize at any year of his career, but they finally recognized him because he did something that was, and this sounds highfalutin, it was noble what he did at that time.
Dan, one of the things I have to thank you for in assembling this book is running a huge chunk of how the good guys finally won. Because reading it, this was kind of personal to me. Tip O'Neill became sort of a surrogate father to me over the years, beginning in the early 1970s. And Leo Deal, his principal deputy, his administrative assistant, I knew for years as well. And to include that, it captured so much of Breslin as a great reporter, his ability to capture different scenes and weave it into the larger tale, which we all know was Watergate and the resignation of Richard Nixon. Thank you for including such a sizable chunk of that in this anthology.
Well, actually, the whole book is in.
Yeah, the whole book is there, but it was also Jim's wise counsel to include it because he rightly recognized that it had relevance today. Here are some people, mostly anonymous people, fighting for democracy, fighting for the way things ought to be. And Jim thought it was relevant today. So,
Well, I have actually 4 questions here, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing any names here, but it's from Richard Walker from Potomac, Maryland, Robert Remler from Port Washington, New York, Nikos Leverins from Honolulu, and Elaine Pugh from Damariscott, Maine. And the question is about what Breslin thought of that other guy from Queens, Donald Trump, and what he think of his continued hold over American politics.
well, I was thinking about reading that. There's a column in the collection where Breslin, the headline is "Trump, the Master of the Steal," and it's written in 1990,
90, I think.
1990.
Yeah.
And we recommend that you buy the volume and read it because it is quite prescient. And what Breslin was doing was not only saying, who is this guy, but also blaming the media for pumping him up, that the media was so eager to get a call from the Donald, as he was called back then. And Breslin, just as he would not have any of that Bernie Getz nonsense, he would have none of this. And he thought that Trump had learned from his father not to spend any of your own money, to spend the money of others. This is what he says. And also the complicity of the news media to prop up this what in Breslin's eyes was an empty suit.
Yeah. All right, this is shifting gears a little bit, but we have a question from from Chevy Chase, Maryland, from John Ollings, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. How would you compare Jimmy Breslin's writing with other great New York journalist writers like Abe J. Liebling or Joe Mitchell, or its Chicago contemporary Mike Royko?
Well, I mean, to me, and listen, I love Liebling and his ability. He was like a miniaturist. Okay, he could tell an amazing story in a limited amount of words. And Joe Mitchell was one of the great teller of New York tales. He's the teller of New York tales that Dan Barry has been for an incredibly long time in our city and in our business. But to me, as great as Royko was, Breslin was the greatest to ever do this kind of work. I love Pete, and Pete was different. Pete was different, and again, they were all I ever wanted to be. I just wanted to get to New York and do what they were doing, if in some small way. But Jimmy was Michael Jordan. I mean, Jimmy was Babe Ruth. Jimmy was, pick any great athlete that you want to talk about. He revolutionized the form. He turned the column into something that was more than punditry. It was walking up stairways and walk and what in his street corner voice. I said to my wife before I came upstairs to do this, I said, going through this book has just reminded me all over again how great this man was at what he did over such an amazingly long period of time.
I think that what distinguishes Breslin from, say, and this isn't meant as a knock on Royko, I think that that generations of journalists tried to emulate Breslin to a fault sometimes, and it was a painful fall when they tried to write like him. But if you go back as we did and read his stuff, there's an economy of language. Every word has a punch to it, and he's doing it on deadline. So Liebling was writing mostly for the New Yorker, and so there was a longer lead time on what he was doing, save for what he did from during World War II. But Breslin is writing on deadline, and he's figuring out how to use language differently and economically in such a way that, to my mind, it rises to literature. And even though he was known as the guy from Queens Boulevard who was hanging out at Pet McGuire's and all this kind of stuff, he was a deep reader of Dostoevsky and all the classics. And he wouldn't wear it on his sleeve, but I think it informed how he wrote as well. I think that's what distinguishes him.
Dan, Absolutely right. Absolutely right on everything you just said. And there's a huge difference between Jimmy Breslin and second place. A huge, huge distance between the two of them. And part of it was his ability, and you mentioned this, he's writing short stories, magnificent short stories, 3, 4, sometimes 5 days a week, but at least 3 days a week on deadline, making every edition on deadline. We mentioned the killing of John Lennon in 70 minutes. He makes the issue. Boom. He files by 2:30 in the morning on deadline. I mean, there are a lot of other newspaper columnists in the world. We're not running any of them down by saying this, but there was Jimmy Breslin, and then there was literally everyone else. Murray Kempton was great. They were all great, but Jimmy Breslin and everyone else.
He was bearing witness too. So he's not sitting in his office opining. Okay.
Yeah.
He's walking up the tenement steps to understand Eleanor Bumpers. He's going to Crown Heights and getting his ass kicked, quite frankly.
Yeah.
So he's bearing witness. He's making the effort to go out there, even though he never learned to drive, right? And his first beloved wife, Rosemary, drove him around.
Ronnie drove him.
Ronnie drove. I know Rosemary, but that's how it began. Just driving to the scenes. And then, so you bear witness, then you go home, you process it, you write it in a literary style, and then you go to your bed.
Yeah. The interesting thing about what you just said is the business has changed so drastically today with online stuff, file it as soon as you get it. And the ability to stop and think about what you just saw, what you just witnessed, what somebody just told you has diminished rapidly in the news business.
I've been listening to both of you, and I showed this book before, Jim. This has been the Bible since I was in high school. Okay, The World of Jimmy Breslin, and what we're talking about is he would write things that stayed with you forever. I mean, dies the victim, dies the city is just one of the most brilliant urban lines of all time. But there's a line that stuck with me, and I'm not going to read a long thing. He's writing about Marian Anderson's last column at Carnegie Hall. I don't know if you remember the column. And this phrase has stayed with me for 1,000 years. But there was some sort of German song midway through the beginning of the concert, and she ended the song with a little low note that ran around through the hall and let everybody know just who was up there on the stage singing for them. And I mean, it's another way for him to talk about genius, and on a night when we're talking about his.
Yeah, I have another question along these lines about Breslin's place in journalism from Martin Beale. I don't have a good location, but it's about Breslin's relationship to what's been called the new journalism. It's a term that he himself disliked, but of course he was working side by side with Tom Wolfe at the New York Herald Tribune. Mailer is also in certain ways associated with the new journalism. I'm interested in how you see Breslin fitting in with those other writers.
Well, I asked Dan before we started if he had ever worked with Paul Montgomery, who was a great national reporter for the Times. I think before Dan got there, and Paul had been in Alabama with Jimmy when they're down there covering Selma in I think it was 1964. And I asked him what it was. I was always fascinated by what Jimmy, the young Breslin, was like at that time. And he said he would get back to New York and he'd read what Jimmy had written. And he would find this mistake or that mistake. And he said, but he would tell you exactly what it was like to be in that church that day in a way that just blew Paul away. And so would he get a quote wrong or would he get a name wrong? That sometimes that wasn't the game. The game was to tell you what it was like to be with him in Ireland, in Selma, in London when Churchill was dying, in Dallas when Kennedy was dying. That was who he was. He took you to the game with him.
I think that I think that Breslin over the years would kind of like poo-poo this whole new journalism thought. And what he would say is, look, what we were doing was, he said he he was following in the footsteps of Jimmy Cannon, a sports writer from the 30s and 40s. And then he would also talk about, well, what we're doing is what Dickens did 100 years ago. So he would kind of like, you know, he was glad. It was one of these things. He's glad he was in the club, but he wasn't like, you know, bragging about it and also holding it a little at a distance, because he was saying what we're doing is we're applying sports writing sensibility to everyday journalism with the information of the Dickenses of the world.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think also if you were asked today about the new journalism, if there is such a thing still in existence, you would say new journalism. You know what new journalism is for all you people out there just starting on the business? Go outdoors, establish eye contact, shake a hand, and climb the stairs.
That's right. That's right. So
Yeah, I have another question.
Don't Google it.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut in. We're reaching the end of our hour, so I thought I should just maybe interrupt and just Jim, I don't know if you had a last question. I do have one question here from Kenneth Turan, the former film critic for NPR and Los Angeles Times. But it kind of goes with what you were just talking about, which is, you know, Breslin's idea of himself as a writer and his aspirations as a writer. Kenny asks, on a scale from unworthy to overdue, what would Breslin have thought of this Library of America edition of his work?
Long overdue.
Overdue.
He would have thought too many words. That's what he would have thought.
He also might have said, "Pay me."
No, you know what he would have said? He would have said, "I'm big."
JB #1.
Thanks, guys, very much, really, for your time.
Thank you.
And your great story.
Thank you,
really,
Dan.
Really wonderful. Thanks,
Thank
Jim.
you. Thanks, everybody.
Jim, thank you. Did an unbelievable job. Dan again, what a wonderful job compiling Jimmy's work.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You've been listening to Dan Barry, Mike Barnicle, and Mike Lupica discuss Jimmy Breslin, Essential Writings, a new volume in the Library of America series edited by Dan Barry. Please join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America. On Monday, April 15th, LOA Live welcomes former U.S. Poet Laureate Tracy K. Smith and Robert Frost biographer Jay Perini for a special National Poetry Month conversation about the beauty and the mystery of some of Robert Frost's most beloved poems. The program marks publication of Robert Frost, 16 Poems to Learn by Heart, edited by Jay Perini. Details about this and other upcoming LOA Live events can be found on our website, LOA.org, where you'll also find information about Library of America's Jimmy Breslin and Robert Frost volumes and links to purchase those and other editions of Great American Writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. If you're watching on YouTube, click subscribe to stay up to date on all our video programs. The free monthly LOA Live series is made possible by support from Library of America members and viewers. Please consider joining as an LOA member. You can learn more at loa.org/join. Thanks so much again to Mike Barnicle, Dan Barry, Mike Lupica, and our moderator, Jim Gibbons, and have a terrific evening.